Hi everyone, we are going to continue reading Peter Pan. We are on chapter 3 and it is called Acorn Kisses and Jealous Fairies. Let's get started. The night lights were still burning when Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, but even a nightlight gets tired sometimes. It is an awful lot of work, as you might imagine, trying to stay bright and shiny all of the time. Wendy's light went out first. It yawned, and yawns being contagious, the other two lights promptly yawned as well. Then, before any of the lights could close their mouths, all three went out from the resulting breeze. The children's room, however, was still not dark. A strange blinking glow came from within a water jug. Inside was a fairy no bigger than your hand. Her name was Tinker Bell, and she was in the jug looking for Peter's shadow. Peter appeared next. "Tink," he called softly, "is my shadow in that jug?" "No," Tink replied, emerging. When Tinker Bell spoke, it sounded like bells. It was a special fairy language that only Peter and his boys could understand. Tink told Peter that she had just spotted his shadow in the chest of drawers. Peter threw open the drawers, piling the clothes in a heap on the floor, and found his shadow. Grabbing it, he tried to slip it back on like a pair of pants, but it would not fit. He tried to put it on like a hat, but it jumped off of his head. His shadow, it seemed, did not want him back. Peter sat on the floor and he started to cry. His cries woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. There is a picture of Peter trying to catch his shadow. "Excuse me," she asked politely. Who are you?" "I am Peter Pan," he said. "Who are you?" "Well, my name is Wendy, darling. I live here." "I live second to the right," said Peter, "and then straight on until morning." "Well, that's a funny address," Wendy said. "I don't see what's so funny about it," Peter huffed, embarrassed. "Well, what do people write on the envelope when they send you letters?" Wendy asked. "No one sends me letters," Peter said in a low voice. Now he was not only embarrassed but sad too about his lack of letters. "Well, when your mother gets letters," Wendy tried weakly. "Oh, I don't have a mother," Peter said in a normal voice. The funny address and the lack of letters had bothered him briefly, but mothers, he felt were overrated. For Wendy, however, a funny address, no letters, and no mother seemed incredibly sad. Show me a connection if you think that that is sad. I think that that's sad. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said. She got out of bed and she ran to give him a hug. "I wasn't crying about not having a mother," he huffed. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow back on. Do you have any glue?" Wendy smiled. How exactly like a boy. "You can't glue it back on, silly. It must be sewn. I will do it for you." Feeling very important, Wendy got her sewing kit, and within minutes the shadow was back where it belonged, even if it was a bit wrinkly. Wendy wondered briefly whether she should have ironed it first. "Yippee!" Peter cried, twirling in front of the mirror. "Look at me and my handsome shadow." A thank you might be nice," Wendy suggested. "For what?" asked Peter. This made Wendy so mad that she got back into bed and she covered her face with the blankets until Peter apologized. "I'll forgive you if you give me a kiss," Wendy said, turning her cheek to him. She was of the age when she was starting to think about kisses. Peter hesitated, confused. Finally, he dropped an acorn button into her hand. Realizing that Peter was not quite at that age yet and not wanting to embarrass him, Wendy politely thanked him and said that she would wear his kiss on a string around her neck. "How old are you?" she asked. "I don't know," Peter said. "I ran away on the very day I was born, after I heard my parents talking about what I would be when I grew up." "Why?" asked Wendy. "I don't want to grow up," Peter said simply. "Now I live with the Lost Boys and the fairies." "Fairies?" Wendy breathed, wide-eyed. Immediately she began to ask Peter everything she could think about to ask about fairies. "You see," Peter explained, "when the very first baby laughed, for the very first time, its laugh broke into 1,000,000 pieces. Each piece then became a fairy." This talk of fairies suddenly reminded Peter of Tinker Bell, who was being awfully quiet, and he rose to look for her. Wendy jumped up excited. "Do you mean to say there's an actual fairy in this room?" And they both listened for her, but all Wendy could hear was the little tinkle of bells. "Oh, that's Tink. That's fairy language," Peter frowned, "and it seems to be coming from inside that chest of drawers." Suddenly, Peter laughed. He realized he had locked Tinker Bell in the drawer. She must have flown in when she reached for his shadow. Oh, how she screamed when he let her out. "Tink," he said, watching her fly around the room in a fury. "Such language!" "Well, what is she saying?" Wendy asked, watching the angry blur. "I do wish she would stand still so I could look at her. Will she be my fairy?" "Tink," said Peter, "stand still for a second, would you? Wendy wants to see you and for you to be her fairy." Tinker Bell clinked something angry in reply. "She says you are a huge, ugly girl, and she can't be your fairy because she's my fairy." "Well," Wendy huffed, "well, she is not very polite." And Peter had to agree. Since Tinker Bell wasn't cooperating, Wendy turned her attention back to Peter. She had so many more questions for him. He told her all about the Lost Boys, who had fallen out of their strollers when they were babies and had never been claimed. "I'm their captain," he said. "What fun," Wendy replied. "But are there no girls on the island?" "Oh, no," replied Peter. "Girls are too smart to fall out of their strollers." "Well, what a nice thing to say," Wendy replied, blushing. Suddenly, Wendy screamed. It felt as if something had pulled her hair. "Oh, that must be Tink," Peter explained. "She certainly is being naughty today." Tinker Bell told Peter that she would continue to misbehave so long as Peter kept being nice to Wendy. Just like Mr. Darling, it seemed that the little fairy suffered from one enormous case of jealousy. So who is Tinker Bell jealous of? She's jealous because Peter is talking to Wendy instead of to Tinker Bell. All right, let's start chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called The Birds Leave the Nest. "Peter," Wendy said, "why did you come to the nursery?" "To hear the story your mother was telling," Peter replied. Wendy was a bit disappointed that he had not come for her, but she asked, "Well, which story was it?" "It was the story about the lady who lost her glass slipper, but I had to leave and I missed the ending." "Oh, that's Cinderella," Wendy said. "I can tell you how it ends. The prince finds her and they live happily ever after." Peter turned to the window. "Oh, wait, where are you going?" Wendy asked. "Back to Neverland to tell the other boys," Peter replied. "Well, don't go," Wendy begged. "I know lots of other stories, even better than that one." "Well then, come on," he said, dragging her. "We'll fly back together. You can tell the stories to the Lost Boys." "Let go of me," cried Wendy. She was very flattered to be asked, of course, but she couldn't leave her poor mother. Besides, she couldn't fly. "I'll teach you," said Peter. Wendy had always wanted to learn how to fly. "I think how much the Lost Boys will love you," Peter continued. "You could be a sort of mother to them. You could even tuck them in. None of them has ever been tucked in before." That was just too much for Wendy to resist. She did have very strong maternal feelings. "What about John and Michael?" she asked. "If I leave them, they will be Lost Boys in a way as well." "Well, they can come. I'll teach them to fly too." And at this, the boys jumped out of bed. They had been listening quietly the entire time, not letting on that they were really awake. But at the thought of flying, they could no longer stay still. Suddenly, Peter spun around. "Shh," he said, and his eyes narrowed. "Listen. Do you hear that?" And Wendy didn't hear anything. "Exactly," said Peter. Nana, sensing his presence, had been barking since Peter had entered the nursery, and now she was suddenly quiet. "There can only be one explanation," John said. "She's broken her chain and is running up here. I want to learn how to fly, and Nana's going to ruin everything." "Pretend to be sleeping," Peter instructed. "Tink and I will hide." So that is what Liza, the family cook, and so it was that Liza, the family cook, saw the children resting peacefully when she entered with the very excited Nana. Liza had finally had enough of Nana's barking and thought the best way to ease the dog's mind would be to bring her upstairs and to show her that the children were fine. "I told you so," she whispered to Nana. "They're all safe and sound, you silly dog." Nana was still suspicious, but Liza would have no more of it. She dragged Nana downstairs and chained her up again. What else could Nana do? She strained and strained at her chain until it finally broke. Then she ran over to where Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dining and burst into the house, barking for help. Even Mr. Darling realized at once that something must be seriously wrong at home. Thanking their host, he and Mrs. Darling rushed out. But it had been 10 minutes since Nana had been in the nursery, and Peter Pan could do a lot in 10 minutes. "You simply think wonderful thoughts," Peter explained, "and they lift you up in the air." The children tried and tried, thinking the happiest thoughts that they could, but still they could not rise from their beds. Of course, Peter was not telling them the whole truth. No one can fly unless some fairy dust has been blown onto them. Tinker Bell was still being uncooperative, but Peter had some dust on his hands from holding her earlier. He blew a bit on each of the children, and wouldn't you know it, they flew. Oh, how they laughed as they sailed clumsily from around the room. "Watch out!" Michael cried as he narrowly missed crashing into his brother by the bathroom. "Let's go outside," John said. "I'm going to fly for 1,000,000 miles, said Michael. Wendy frowned. It suddenly all seemed a bit too real and risky now that her brothers were involved. But the sly Peter knew how to make her come along. "Did I tell you about the mermaids?" he said. "Mermaids?" Wendy breathed. Mermaids were even more exciting then fairies, and pirates, Peter added. Let's go at once, said John. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were almost home, but they were not close enough. From the middle of the street they gasped as they looked up at the bedroom window. Beyond the curtain, the room was ablaze with light. Inside, they could see 3 little shallows whirling around and around, not on the floor, but incredibly in the air. Now, not all 3 figures, but 4. The star, still watching them from above, called out a warning. Peter, the grown-ups are coming back! And there was no time to lose. Peter threw open the window. Come on, he cried, soaring into the night. John, Michael, and Wendy followed. Still on the street, Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana watched in horror as their 3 little birds left the nest, and they were gone. All right, friends, that is the end of our reading today. We will read chapter 5 tomorrow. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.